Hello again, everyone, and welcome back to Reddit Aliens. I'm John, and as always, thank you so much for being here. Good topic? Let's do it. What's the most shocking, unexpected, or surprising deathbed confession anyone has ever made to you? Please remember to like, share, and subscribe.
I don't know if this fits in here, but the first death I witnessed was a dementia ward. The patient has been sad and depressed as long as I'd known her. No matter what we did to cheer her up, it just didn't stick. One morning I went into her room to get her out of bed and make her ready for the day. She sat up in her bed with her feet straight out. She somehow looked like a little child, and she was smiling. Delighted that she looked happy. I exclaimed, "Are you already up, friend?" She answered, so happy and so smiley, "Yes, I'm going home today." I took her to the bathroom, and right there in my arms, she went home. I was young, and it scared me back then, but now I cherish that memory. We should all be so lucky to leave the world happy and content. I had an elderly lady in for shortness of breath. She was a very petite but otherwise healthy 90-year-old who lived independently at home. She had been with us for about 5 hours at this point. She's ready for imaging, so the husband goes to get her an overnight bag, and we head to imaging. Fully lucid, stable blood pressure, sinus rhythm, 99% sats on room air, asks me to tell her husband, when he came back, that she loves him very much and has enjoyed her life with him. 15 minutes later, we return to the room. I plug her monitor back into the podium, and she rests. She didn't get to tell him she loved him that one last time, like I reassured her she would. I often think about that man. I think he would have shortly passed from a broken heart, the way he looked at her after 70 plus years of marriage. I thought I'd add another true love death story. An elderly lady, again in her 90s, collapsed in the shower at home. She was the carer for her husband, who had mild dementia. Her husband heard the fall, found her unconscious, and called the ambulance. She arrived with lights and sirens, with a GCS of 6, not awake, doesn't respond to verbal commands, but has a reflex response to pain. As she was being removed from the back of the ambulance, a colleague was assisting the husband out of the front of the ambulance. As he was exiting the ambulance, he had lost his footing, fell down, hit his head, and was also now unconscious. They both had catastrophic brain bleeds, were palleted in a bariatric bed together, and they both passed away within hours of each other. None the wiser that poor health had impacted them, and they never had to go through the pain of losing their life partner. I often think about their children and hope they can see the beauty in their passing amongst the grief. Honestly, this man may have been transferred from my facility instead of passing, but I'll never forget the elderly man I took care of who, in the throes of his dementia, was fighting mad about his wife giving him the clap. That's all he'd ever yell about, day and night, nonstop. How dare she, that hussy? The clap, can you believe it? By now they're both surely past. Hope she was ready for him to come swinging at her in the afterlife. Brought a pediatric patient back for emergency heart surgery about 14 years old. He was very nervous. Outlook looked grim. I held his hand as they began to induce anesthesia. He looked like he was about to cry. I told him there was nothing to worry about. He was going to be just fine. He gripped my hand super tight as the prop fell, looked me in the eye and said, "I'm going to die, aren't I?" I told him I would be there in the PACU when he woke up. He died on the table. I was the last thing he ever saw. 8 years later, I still think about that kid. I still see his face, the fear in his eyes. I still feel guilty that I lied right to his face. Working in oncology at the time, I had an older gentleman with liver cancer that had spread everywhere, including his brain. Having brain mets made him very vague, often nonsensical. He was in and out of consciousness and never really answered questions appropriately, in that his answers were very random. This is not unusual for people with brain tumors. He also had a thick Eastern European accent His kids explained they immigrated from Russia in the late 80s to Australia. Our focus was on comfort care for him, as he was the palliative due to the extensive metastases throughout his body. Anyway, one day I'm taking his vitals and he grabs my hand, looks me straight in the eyes and just says to me, "You know, I've killed so many people," in his very strong accent. I kinda just froze and didn't know what to say, but he let go and went back to sleep and reduced consciousness. Often, people have a moment of clarity or make sense for a brief episode right before they pass. I didn't take it as a threat or anything, it just freaked me out. He passed away that evening after my shift was over, so I always wondered if this was a deathbed confession of sorts. I wasn't a nurse, but a CNA. Working in dementia care, I was helping a resident with a bath, having a typical conversation with him about his day, my day, etc. For his dementia, it was considered a great day. Near the end, he thanked me, my name, for the help, but then he quickly grabbed my hand saying, "Thank you for being here, daughter's name." She hadn't visited him in a long time. He dozed off as I was cleaning up supplies, and when I patted his head as a goodbye gesture, not to wake him, I realized he had passed. I was 16. It really shaped my perception of both death and love. I'm a nurse now, and honestly have seen many more sudden and traumatic deaths since this one, but this one is always the first I think of. Back when I was a CNA at a nursing home about 6 years ago, our scrub color was either teal, purple, or medium blue, and that day I happened to wear my new light blue scrubs that were a little brighter than technically allowed. I only add this detail because I think it might have played a role here. There was this one resident who was much younger than most there, only in her mid-60s. She was in really rough physical and mental shape due to severe liver failure and other compounding issues for years. She didn't have much family visit, although I heard she had a husband, and she was there for at least a year. She never spoke more than a moan, and couldn't really maintain eye contact or do much. She would just need to be turned and cleaned up often. The day I was wearing those new scrubs, and in there cleaning her like normal, she suddenly looked right at me and in a very soft, clear voice said, "You look like an angel." I remember being pretty shocked that she spoke out loud and kinda just said, "Isn't this a pretty color?" She went back to being nonverbal the rest of the shift, and I remember thinking about it a lot until I went home. When I got back 2 days later, I found out she had died in her sleep that night. I never told anyone she spoke because I started to doubt myself and felt really weird. I also got yelled at for wearing those scrubs since they were technically out of uniform, lol. I always will remember that woman, even though honestly I don't think anyone else thinks about her anymore. I'm a nursing assistant and definitely have some stories. I've had a few senior women who are in different stages of dementia describe violent SA they experienced as a child. Many of the stories were similar in the sense that when they told their parents, they were blamed or not taken seriously. Really heartbreaking, but I never knew if they were actually true stories. I once had a man who was extremely sick, confused, and at the end stages of life. I had only dealt with him on 2 separate occasions, a few days apart, so I wasn't super familiar with him. He confessed on both occasions to beating a woman to death in great detail. Then, the where and the why. I reported it, but never heard anything back. None of the staff that had worked with him previously had heard this. One nurse told me someone had mentioned he may have vaguely mentioned something about it, but didn't know the details. Also not sure if it was the confusion or true, but the amount of details he had and the way he said he was ready to put away for it was really disturbing. I've had a couple of people tell me they committed murder. Neither was 100% in control of their mental faculties, so I can't know if it was factual. Though one woman was so detailed that my feeling is she did it. Smothered her newborn because she believed it would prevent her and older kids from escaping an abusive relationship. He would have killed me if I tried to take his child away. And going to be with God was better than having that man as a father. died soon after. I was a very young nurse and honestly would much rather have not have heard about it. Not a nurse, but a physician. This happened when I was a resident. Patient wasn't even dying. We thought he was stable. He told us on morning rounds that he felt guilty about his estrangement from his kids, and that it stemmed from the fact that he drove his ex-wife to suicide. Like, encouraged her to kill herself, and she did. Out of the blue, he had a massive heart attack and died that evening. He was not in the hospital for anything related to that. I work with dementia clients. I have had so many pre-death confessions. Sometimes it's as if the dementia leaves them just before they pass away. A mind-blowing confession I always think about was a veteran who confessed to all the war crimes he committed and how he felt so terrible for all the things he did. He said this was the reason he had no relationship with his family, and to be honest, I don't blame his family for not having anything to do with him. I'm in hospice, and I'm beyond thinking of anything as weird or creepy at this point. I mostly work with pediatric patients, but I see adult patients on call for other nurses sometimes. Most recently, Jim, in his 80s, told me his grandpa was sitting in the chair in the corner of his room. He said, "I know he's dead, but he's there." I asked if it was scaring him, and he said, "No, but he's telling me not to take my medications." I asked him what he thought would happen if he stopped his meds, and he said, "We stopped his medications, and Jim died a week later." Sylvia was also A&O times 4, but right after being admitted, she started telling me about a tall black figure she was seeing in her apartment. She called him Scratch because he scratched on the doors and walls. He started at the front door but gradually moved closer and closer to the bed. She wasn't afraid of him. Eventually he moved past her bed and onto the balcony, and she said he stopped scratching and was refilling her bird feeders and watering her plants. Benny saw his decreased family peeking into his windows and waving at him from the backyard. I've had a couple of affairs mentioned to me by patients, and one guy who wanted me to find his second family he'd abandoned who'd wanted nothing to do with him. They declined. Lots of estranged children and estranged parents. Usually people pull it together for the patient. Sometimes it's a mess. Not a nurse, but a few years ago I wasn't feeling great. Nothing crazy, but I felt extra tired. I kept telling my husband it was fine. It was COVID and I didn't want to go to a hospital. One night I'm asleep and wake up at 3 a.m. to a tall black figure standing over the bed looking down at me. I screamed and it woke my husband. The next morning I couldn't even lift my arm to blow dry my hair. My husband said, "Okay, right now you're going." When I got to urgent care, they immediately rushed me to the hospital because my hemoglobin was at 3. I think there are definitely messages that come through when you're on the verge. Lots from COVID stuck with me. ICU nurse here. Many passed due to vaccine misinformation. I can think of patients who told me that they wanted the vaccine after they were sick. I remember one in particular. His wife recently passed from COVID, and he wanted to watch her funeral, but had no way of watching it. He was an elderly man without much technological experience. I was able to pull up the live stream using my phone and let him watch. After the funeral was over, he called me in the room to tell me he was ready to pass. He was extremely sick, but still conscious, and wanted all oxygen and meds to be turned off. We gave him morphine and Versed, and he passed in less than 10 minutes. I frequently flash back to all the patients that we gave iPads to so they could FaceTime their family one last time before being intubated, death sentence. Some patients would get to that point at 2 a.m. and they would call their families multiple times without anyone picking up. Still breaks my heart. Also had a patient who was close to discharging tell me about dreams they had where the Reaper was following them everywhere they went. While waiting for his bride to come pick him up, he went into cardiac arrest and we never got him back. This isn't a confession per se, but the eerie story I've ever encountered. We had a patient in the ICU for months, sick with liver failure, perforated bowels, CRRT, the works. He was so yellow from liver failure, He almost looked like he was glowing. He eventually went into cardiac arrest and passed away. Sent him to the morgue and cleaned the room. A few hours later, we admit an elderly, confused man with dementia for a fall. I'm moving him over to his bed, and the first thing he asks is, "Why is there a yellow man standing in the corner of my room?" I was shaking.
So what do you guys take away from this? Do you think that part of it may be that momentary lucidity near the end of life? Is it something that the person really did? A hallucination? Maybe some combination, but there seems to be a lot of common threads or themes from everyone who answered the question. So have you ever been a part of hearing any of these yourself?
I've got several, but this is one of my favorites. 98-year-old guy with heart failure decided to go with comfort care only. He was on a lot of meds to keep him comfortable until his room was ready. I was one-on-one with him in the ED, basically keeping him well so he could pass in peace when his family and friends arrived. I asked him, "So, 98 years, what have you learned?" His response was awesome. He said, "Sex. If I knew the last time I had it was going to be the last time, I would not have been such a gentleman." I don't know why, but in his halting gasps, it always makes me laugh. Approach everything with gusto, ladies and gentlemen, like it might be your last time. I am not a nurse, but I work as a training and development specialist for medical stuff. Like I write guides, teach people how to use programs, etc. I had a colleague who had been doing this much longer, and she said she once had to work a geriatric LTC unit during implementation. It's where we hang around and help people get used to the new system on a workday. Anyway, she said that this unit was naturally filled with older people. The patients could wander around in a confined unit, so having them meander around nurses' stations wasn't unusual. She said she was there one night when this old man wandered up to the nurse. He was well known and perhaps a long-timer. He wanted to use the phone to call his daughter. Now, a lot of patients have dementia, and they get confused or out of sorts. So I guess the nurse just waved him off, saying they'll call her later. The old guy looked right at the nurse and said, No, I packed up. I made it easier for her." Again, the nurse thinks, oh, he believes he's leaving. "Okay, dear, I'll tell her. Can you call her and let her know I left the watch or something meaningful for her? She can donate the rest." Then he just abruptly shuffles off back to his room. An hour later, he died. My colleague was apparently really freaked out and had to help the nurse put in a deceased workflow in the system. The notes sounded wild to her. I guess the old man knew it was coming and packed up everything so his daughter could have an easier time. On the opposite side here, I've died clinically once, though thankfully I was resuscitated. I grew up in the slums of Rio. It was extremely violent, and the only way to avoid being part of the drug cartel and not having protection to survive was to be part of a gang. I was part of a gang made only of girls. At the time, the average life expectancy of us there was 23. When I was 15, I got stabbed in the guts and went down the Dona Marta, which is a very steep way down, to the public hospital at the base. I got there, and I was 200% sure I was going to die of blood loss. My last words to the nurse before I passed out were, "Will you tell my friends I was brave?" I wasn't thinking of my parents or my family. I was worried for the other girls. It seems extremely sophomoric now, but it meant a lot back then. In a way, reputation was everything, and I didn't want other gang members to think less of my friends if I died scared. I work in a nursing home. One of our residents was a well-known local pimp in his younger years. It involved filming videos of young girls for his rental business. Nicest man in the world now. Everyone at the nursing home loves him. Another resident harbored a known serial killer when there was a statewide manhunt for him. She was related by marriage, but this was what women did for the men back in the day. She's in the book about it and everything. A third resident did hard time for having stockpiled explosives in his house. There was enough to have wiped out the houses on either side of him. Now in a nursing home, he steals and hoards things like batteries, wires, etc., and is always building something.
We've even had the police in to toss his room once. Those are just a couple of backstories I know. It can make caring for people complicated. You really have to suspend judgment and deal compassionately with what's right in front of you. A grumpy, nasty old gentleman who had an acute deterioration in his COPD and opted for palliative care. We called and called his next of kin to come in and say goodbye, but they either didn't answer or one of them even said, "Don't call us back until he's gone." He managed to tell us it was because he had married a young Thai bride and had changed his will to leave everything to her, but even they had separated and she didn't want to see him. He had alienated all of his children and had never even met or tried to meet his grandchildren. Another nurse and I still held his hands, told him it was okay, and played calming music for over an hour while he passed. And afterwards, we cried for him and treated his body with the utmost respect as we prepared him for the morgue. No one deserves to die alone, and I will never feel bad for showing shit people kindness, and I think that's part of why I like being a nurse. Geriatric psych. I had a patient who would scream and be desolate, stating he had hurt those girls by touching them inappropriately. Couldn't make heads or tails of it, but tried everything to calm him. He always needed chemical sedation during these events, which was sometimes 2 times a day. Talked to his son. No female family members or such. The patient was the only child of only children who had 2 sons, but let him know his father's words. The patient ended up dying. I'm sure he molested some girl somewhere in history, but none could be identified. He tortured himself over it in his last few weeks, so I hope it wasn't a delusion, but I'm also glad he doesn't have to suffer through that hell because it really tortured his dementia-addled brain. I hope the girl forgave him and were able to lead decent lives either way. Not exactly a nurse one, but about 2 nights before my granny died, my mother was staying in the hospital with her, keeping her company that night. We have a big family, and when one person would go into the hospital, we'd always have around-the-clock attention. Anyway, my mother went out and slept on a bench just outside of the ward for a few hours, and she came back into my granny, giving off to her, saying that an old family friend was here talking to her the whole night, and she kept saying for him to wait because my mom was coming back and she had embarrassed him because she was nowhere to be seen and she was running out of things to say to him. This family friend had been dead about 20 years at this stage. A few hours later, she was complaining that there were birds flying around the ward and they were annoying her. She was asking my mom if they were annoying her, and of course Mom couldn't see any birds flying about the place. There obviously were no birds inside the hospital. I'm not sure whether it was the drugs she was on, etc., making her mind wander a bit in the days before her death, but it really is a bit eerie. I flipped my car off the highway going 70 miles per hour. I could still remember trying to take control and then almost giving up. I remember watching the windshield glass breaking in slow motion. I remember consciously thinking, this is it, I'm gonna die, and being completely and perfectly calm. To me, I had lived a good life and had no regrets and was willing to let the Grim Reaper take me. I passed out and woke up to 5 people around the car. I thought I was on the other side of life because I had passed out for the first time. It took everyone to crowd around. They towed my car to a junkyard, and I'll never forget the fact that if I had rolled on my side and not to the right, I would have been crushed. The headrest of the passenger seat was smashed, and the indent on the roll was all on that right passenger side. I'm thankful to be alive and also not scared of death, just worried about the ones that love me that I'll leave behind when my time comes. My mother was dealing with high blood pressure, increased glucose levels, hyperacidity, cold, and body pains. It all happened in 1.5 days, so we never could see it coming, which is why we never took her to the hospital and she was resting at home. The cold meant she had a stuffy nose, hence she was breathing through her mouth, and the body pains meant she couldn't lie still on the bed for any longer than 2 minutes. Throughout what were the last 4 hours of her life, she was just breathing through her mouth and getting up to sit upright because of the back aches from lying down and body pains, and then lying down again because of no energy in the body from a poor appetite across the day, repeatedly. In the last 30 minutes, she sat upright, dragged herself to the edge of the bed to fall on the floor in a sitting position, and crawled her way across to me. where I was sitting on a couch so I could stay up all night vigilant to her needs. She placed her hands, palms, one over the other, on my thigh, and then laid her head on this new makeshift pillow she made for herself, where she slept uninterrupted or without much discomfort for 20 minutes. It was the longest duration she managed to sleep across the entire day, despite being on bed rest. I made it a point not to move an inch until a mosquito bit me on the foot and forced an intervention that disrupted her sleep. It would turn out that her last ever nap was spent in her son's lap, in a somewhat spine-chilling full circle of life. It was quite difficult to see the guiding light of my life leave like that. But thanks to the wonderful people around me, I've looked at that experience from a perspective of her seeking comfort in those moments of pain from someone she loved so unconditionally, and it is truly a privilege to be able to give my mother that comfort before she left. Very early on in my career, like a freshly minted nurse, I had a patient who had stayed overnight in the surgical ward for observation following a gallbladder removal. The plan was to discharge them after the surgeon had seen them in the morning. His procedure went very well, and he had no complications at all the previous day, and he wasn't in a great deal of pain, so I wasn't worried about him too much. I went to go see him and grab his vitals for the morning, and in the process I was flushing his IVs just to make sure they worked in case anything crazy happened and he needed emergency meds. As I'm doing that, he looks at me and just straight up says, "Mary Jake, I'm going to die." Obviously that caught me off guard a little bit, so I asked him to elaborate, to which he replied, "I see two of you dying." I quickly threw him down in his bed, and he went unresponsive after that. No pulse. He really was not lying about saying he was dying. We ran the code, and he ended up doing very well. His heart restarted after 2 rounds of compressions and 1 dose of epinephrine. He went to the ICU for a couple of days, and when I returned to work the following week, I had a note waiting for me at the desk to go see the patient in room such and such. So I go down there, and it's him, very much awake, lively, and cursing me for how hard I pumped on his chest. But he and his wife were very thankful, and we both remarked on how lucky he was that I was right next to him to start CPR when he lost his pulse, as it would have been very unlikely he would have survived had I not been in the room with him because he wasn't on a cardiac monitor. Harrowing experience. I can't imagine the feeling of knowing you're going to die. I'll never forget the look on his face as that was happening. It was horrifying. The ICU team never did figure out why he coded either. His entire workup was negative. The consensus was it was just a freak incident, and he was a lucky man. Not a nurse, but my grandmother. She had been in the process of passing for a few days, but was still holding on. My granddad had passed less than 6 earlier, so she had pretty much given up. Everyone she cared about had been in to see her and tell her goodbye except for me, because selfishly, I didn't want to remember her that way. I'd been a CNA for 4.5 years, so I was very familiar with death and the entire process. I just didn't want that to be my last memory of her. Mom called and said, "It's closed. You'd better get here." So I finally went. I went into her room and the lights were dim. My mom and dad were there. I went up to her and told my mom to open the window. I'd learned from the old timers that you open the windows so their spirit can escape. I just told my grandma that I was sorry I hadn't been there yet and she could go. She didn't have to hold on anymore. She could go be with Granddad. Mom decided to play her and Granddad's wedding song, and she passed as the song ended. I don't know if she was waiting on me or if it was all just big coincidence, but it made me feel like I mattered to her and helped her go. I'm a hospice nurse. Not as many deathbed confessions because folks usually aren't lucid or talking at the end of life. Lots of people will have terminal lucidity and say that they're going to die, or if they have dementia, they might say a bus is coming to get them or they're going on a trip. But the big moment of death thing that stuck with me was a woman who literally right before her last breath opened her eyes, stared at something we couldn't see, let out a gut-wrenching cry or wail, and died. It really kind of chilled me. I told her family it wasn't uncommon to have some final burst of energy, true, but I didn't tell them I'd never seen it present like that. Usually it's just a sigh or a teardrop, not a fucking scream. This doesn't quite fit as I'm not a nurse, but last year my great-grandfather passed. I live 4 hours away from my family. My mom gave me a call shortly before his passing to come visit because it will be the last time I'd see him. In his late 90s on hospice, not doing well. Well, after I'd visited and come home, I got a FaceTime from my mom. She stayed with him along with her mom in his final days. The reason she FaceTimed me was because my great-grandpa kept asking for me and saying he needed me. When she put me on the phone with him, all he wanted to ask me was if I was okay, that he moves on to the other side. I assured him that it was okay, and no one would be mad at him. Afterward, my mom told me that he had said I came to him in his sleep last night to help him to the other side, and he wanted to talk to me to make sure it was okay to go. Sure enough, he passed that night. I think about it sometimes, an odd feeling that I, for some reason, was what helped him let go. I got permission to tell this story from a friend who was a nurse. We had an elderly patient who was already getting ready to pass for the weeks. She was in the hospital. Only one person came to see her, and it was her sister. The sister told me she was a very horrible person, abandoned her kids and did drugs, and just her life reflected what's going on with her now. But in the time in the hospital, the sister managed to have the whole family get together for her final days as they were going to pull the plug. I sat there with the family as she took her last breaths. She flatlined, and as me and 3 other doctors were going to confirm TOD, she suddenly shoots up, looks in the corner, screams a blood-curdling scream that freaks everyone on the floor out, and then she passed for good. Literally, everyone in the room was completely shocked. My friend told me that story, and it freaked me out. Makes you wonder what she saw.